The broadest measure of how the economy is doing is with gross domestic product, GDP. Very important to get the precise definition of GDP. And the idea is it's the market value of all the final goods and services newly produced in a country during some time period. The key ideas are underlined. What do you mean by market value? It's the total amount that people spend or produce in the economy measured by the market prices. You want to, for example, you want to have some way to add up the amount of toys that are produced with the amount of necklaces that are produced. Those are not comparable things unless you have a price associated with them. But if you multiply the price of toys times the quantity of toys produced and the price of necklaces times the quantity of necklaces to produce, then you have two dollar magnitudes, the dollars spent on necklaces and the dollars spent on toys. So now you can add them together and you get a dollar magnitude. And you can do that with all the goods in the economy, all the services, all the goods that are produced. So it's the market value of all these. And you might say, well, I don't think it makes sense to value necklaces at that price. They're not worth that much. Or you could say, I think you should value toys at a higher price. They're really worth more than that to people. And that very well might be the case from an individual perspective, but basically prices, as you know, convey a sense of value. It's hard to see what else you would do. In any case, that's what we do in measuring gross domestic product. Next important word is final. We want a measure of the final goods that are produced, not intermediate goods. Any kind of production process, whether it's producing cars, has intermediate goods. Producing cars, you need steel or aluminum. Producing the tires in the cars, you need rubber. Those are the intermediate goods that are used to produce the final goods. For gross domestic product, we want to look at the final amount of the goods that is produced, because again, we're looking at the total amount of production. We want to make sure we only look at what's newly produced. Newly produced means we don't count a used car that's purchased, because that was produced earlier years. We only look at the new car that's produced because we're interested in what's produced in a particular period now. And finally, it's in a country. That is, the domestic refers to in a country like the United States, like Mexico. We're looking at GDP for a particular country. And then of course, this refers to a time period, like 2013, like 2014, like the first quarter of 2013. It's the time period it measures what was actually produced during that period of time. So those are the key things. We use the word domestic to refer to the fact that it's in a country. We use the word product to represent the fact that it's things that are actually produced. And we use the word gross because when we measure investment, we don't subtract out the deterioration of investment. We look at the total amount that's spent on investment, say, the total amount that's spent on a new truck. We don't subtract out the fact that we may lose some old trucks because they fall apart. So that's the reason for the word gross. We'll see more about that later. Note there's a few things that are omitted from gross domestic product. If people cook a meal at home rather than go out, that meal at home is not counted in GDP, even though it took effort to produce it, the same amount of effort that it would have produced to make the meal at a restaurant. So that's unpaid work at home doesn't count. Not clear how you would count it. And then the underground economy is not counted either. Illicit drug trade or just informal work where the income is not reported. Say a painter of a house gets a payment, some money that's paid won't be reported. So that's not counted either. We hope that those things don't change in great magnitudes over time, by great amounts over time, so they don't really affect the general pattern of GDP. And I think that's generally true for an economy like the United States. And then finally, let's emphasize that GDP doesn't measure everything. It doesn't measure how long people live, doesn't measure infant mortality, doesn't measure income distribution. It's the total amount that's produced in the economy. Those other things are important, of course, but you can get measures of life expectancy, infant mortality, income distribution. They're just different things. Those don't mean that gross domestic product is a faulty concept. It just is not attempting to measure everything. Indeed, we'll find that it's quite useful despite the fact that it omits a few things, as in this example. So now let's consider a particular case of how GDP is calculated and measured. And the example will be the United States economy in the second quarter of 2013. I've listed here what gross domestic product actually is. It's in billions of dollars. It's $16,661 billion. That's $16.661 trillion. That's the total amount produced in the second quarter of 2013. When you think of a number like this, you have to recognize not just the fact that it's measured in billions, but that the statisticians who report the number, they make a seasonal adjustment because frequently, like the fourth quarter of the year, there's more spending because of the holidays, and the first quarter of the year, there's less spending, and the second quarter is kind of medium. And so they try to take out those regular seasonal every year fluctuations and report the idea of just seasonally adjusted numbers. And then finally, they use this concept of annual rates. So annual rates is a measure that pertains to a whole year. So more precisely, the 16.661 trillion represents what's produced in the second quarter, but at an annual rate. So the real numbers that are produced in the quarter are really, that's 4 times what the real numbers are produced. And by multiplying by 4, we get this annual rate concept. The way to think about it is, if the economy produced in all quarters of 2013, the first, the third, and the fourth, what it produced in the second quarter, then the total production during the year would be 16.661 trillion. So by multiplying by 4, you get an annual rate. Having said that, now let's consider the other parts of this gross domestic product and how you can divide it up. One part is consumption. That's what people are spending on consumption goods, households are spending. And that's 11.427 trillion. Then there's the amount that businesses spend, that's investment it's called, that's 2.621 trillion. And then at the bottom, just switch to the bottom, government purchases, that's what government spends, 3.122 trillion, $3,122 billion. And then note there's something that has to be subtracted here. What's subtracted is net exports. And if you look at the bottom, net exports is is represented by the difference between exports and imports. So the 509 billion with a minus sign is exports minus imports, and exports are 2239, imports are 2748, so the difference is 509. So by adding in net exports, which happens to be negative in this case, you're making an important adjustment that reflects what GDP is. So for example, the sunglasses that I talked about a few minutes ago, they were not produced in the United States. You can see that they're produced in China. But I bought them. It was part of my consumption. It's part of that 11427 number under consumption. But it wasn't produced in the United States, so I have to subtract it out. The statisticians have to subtract it out. And so effectively, they subtract it out as part of imports. It's part of the imports number. And by adding in net exports, which is exports minus imports, you're subtracting that imports. Similarly, there's some goods that are produced in the United States but are consumed elsewhere. The U.S. will export them. And so you want to count that in your production of GDP, even though no firm, no government, no individual purchased it. And so that's got to be added, and that's why exports are added. Again, by adding in net exports, we add in exports and subtract imports, and that's what's illustrated in the table. So that's basically how you get the GDP. If you add up all those numbers, you get the total. And indeed, there's some symbols that economists use. They use to represent these things. Y is a symbol for gross domestic product we will use in our models and considering the data. C is consumption. I is investment. We're going to say X is net exports and just use G for government purchases. And since C plus I plus X plus G equals Y, we have an important equation. This important equation is used in our models. It's going to be used to examine relationships. It's actually true. It's an accounting identity. Is one of the equations in our models which will always hold. Again, Y equals C plus I plus X plus G, where X is exports minus imports. And now you know why we can think of it that way. Having shown how we measure this, let's just go back and make sure we know why we did these various things, why we counted some things and not others. The key idea is that when we add up spending, what people spend in consumption, what households spend in consumption or businesses spend in investment, our aim is to get a measure of production. So I say keep your eye on the ball when you're thinking about this. We want to measure production in the economy in a particular period. We can think about 4 spending groups, buying things, households, firms, governments, and foreigners. Consumption is what households spend. Investment is what firms spend. And there's an important thing here. When we consider investment, we want to add an inventory investment. It's a tricky thing. We'll come back to it. It's a tricky thing, but you got to add an inventory investment. What is inventory investment? It's the amount of increase in goods on the shelves of firms or the material that's in production. So if you consider it's the Halloween season and you go and you see various little pumpkin patches with all the pumpkins there on the yard ready to be sent. And 3 weeks ago there was nothing. And then during the Halloween season you see a big increase in pumpkins in the storefronts or in the places where people go to buy the pumpkins in the yards. That's an increase in inventory. We want to add that to investment. Why do we want to add it? Well, because it was produced. Even though people haven't purchased those inventories, even though the consumer hasn't gotten the pumpkin yet, it's been produced, and so we need to add that in. It was produced, and so it's got to be there. When the consumer goes and buys the pumpkin, then that consumer's house consumption will go up, and the inventory will go down. And so it nets out just as you want, so that the adding up these numbers becomes GDP. I mentioned why we add in net exports, and I'll just finally emphasize that the G in the C plus I plus G is only government purchases. It's the purchases of tanks for the military, or it's the payment of school teachers to teach school. It doesn't include transfers, like Social Security transfers to retired people, or it doesn't include food stamps to the poor to buy food. Those are considered transfers from the government to individuals. It doesn't represent a production of a product, like, for example, a teacher teaching a class or a soldier providing security. That's a product of or a service. And so those purchases are included, but not the transfers. So that's how it goes. And now let's just look at what we get as a result of this. This is now taking those concepts and applying them quarter by quarter back into the 1940s and just reporting what we see. Vertical axis is billions of dollars. So the point over there on the far right is what GDP was in the second quarter of 2013. We already know it's 16.661 trillion, or 16,661 billion. A point is indicated there. But now we see what's happened over time. We see that, if you like, expansion of the size of the economy. We also see some ups and downs. In fact, recently there's this big down, which is quite visible. That was the Great Recession of 2007, 8, and 9. To better track what's happening in the economy, we're going to consider a concept called real gross domestic product, which basically just takes out the general increase in prices in the economy. Inflation means the prices of all goods rise, as we will see. So we don't want to say GDP is higher just because everything's more expensive, even though more is not being produced. Again, we're trying to measure what's being produced. So economists have a way to take out that inflationary effect, and what they get is then this real gross domestic product. And you can see on the vertical axis here, we're now measuring this in what they call constant dollars, 2009 dollars. It's as if we applied 2009 prices both back to 1950, 1960, as well as into the future, 2013. And that's a way to control for the fact that prices are higher in general now than they were in 1980 or 1970. And they're, in 2009, they're lower than they are now. And so that gives you this correction for real gross domestic product. And we're going to be looking at that some more. Now, finally, let's think about these fluctuations versus growth. Measuring GDP and thinking about these concepts. I've superimposed on the real GDP line a trend. It's a trend that's estimated by economists in Washington who keep track of these. It's called the Congressional Budget Office. And they're trying to get an estimate of what the longer-term trends in the economy is. They call it potential GDP. The real GDP, you can see, fluctuates around it. So we're going to be both studying the growth, that is the upward trend in that line, the red line that's growing there. You can see it going up in the picture quite well. It's growing up like that. But we also want to see these wiggles, if you like, and try to understand what's going on with them. And so those are the fluctuations, and you can see there's both going on. We're trying to separate those out in many of our theories. You can imagine it's hard to separate it out. Sometimes we don't know if a wiggle is a new trend or just something you're going to come back to trend. But we have to somehow divvy it up to some extent, because the theory of economic growth is somewhat different than the theory of economic fluctuations, and we want to understand why that's the case. When you think of those ups and downs in the economy, you want to think about the concept of recessions and recovery, and to use the economics lingo as precisely as possible. By definition, a recession is when real GDP falls. And this is illustrated in this picture. Actually, there's two recessions indicated. In this recession over here, you can see there was a decline in real GDP. And then we had a recovery, it started to rise again. And then it fell, we had another recession. So again, the recessions are the period where you're declining. And we sometimes say that the start of a recession is called the peak. See, that's the top of it. And the bottom of the recession is called the trough. That's the bottom of it right there. And it gives us some ways to think about when a recession starts, that's the peak. When it ends, that's the trough. And when the recovery actually begins. This language sometimes is confusing because people think of recession as a bad time, and it is a bad time. But the truth is, the early parts of recoveries are bad times too, because here, for example, the economy still hasn't gotten back to where it was at the start of the recession. So people would say, hey, I don't have a job. I don't think this is the end of the recession. I think we're still in a recession or recovery. But to be precise about the economic lingo, the recession is actually over at the earlier point. So having defined what we mean by recessions and recoveries and peaks and troughs, let's actually look at in a particular example of what happened in the recession in 2007, 8, and 9. So here we're looking at real GDP again, and you can see that real GDP reached a peak there. That's what we call the beginning of the recession of 2007, 2008, and 2009. It reached a bottom over here. That's the trough of that period. And it basically was coming down. It didn't come down steadily. It was a little bit of an up there, but basically down quite sharply, actually. And so that's the recession period. Between those lines, we call that the recession. And then the recovery began right here. We started moving up, and that's the recovery period. You can't see in this diagram, but economists are concerned this recovery is quite weak. We want to be understanding and try to be understanding of this idea and explore exactly whether that recovery is a good one or a bad one. But this illustrates the concept quite naturally, and particularly with respect to what happened in this most recent recession in the United States. And just to emphasize, we're looking at billions of 2009 dollars, so this is controlling for inflation. And that is a real drop in production. It's a substantial decline because of that recession. Finally, let's look at the recessions and recoveries through a longer period. This is a kind of graph which economists find quite useful. It has all the recessions marked in the shaded areas. The one we just looked at is over here. That's the recession 2007, 8, and 9. Now you can see that decline is quite large. It has a recession here in the 2000. It's relatively mild, 2000, 2001 recession, and we have one here in the early 90s, a little shorter. And then we had quite a few back here. So this gives you a sense that how these recessions and recoveries are recurrent in not only in the United States economy, but in all economies. And the job in macroeconomics is try to understand those ups and downs, but at the same time understand what's more impressive over the long haul, and that is that steady upward path, the economic growth. Again, it's growth and fluctuations that we want to focus on in macro, and using real GDP and looking at its ups and downs and growth over time helps us measure that. Thank you.